Welcome back to Proxamer, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at how to play the Craftworld Eldar on foot. And we're going to be looking at the keys to success when running what a lot of players call Footdar. So Footdar essentially was a term coined a long time ago when players ran Eldar basically entirely on foot. So that means that every single unit pretty much in the army was walking. So Footdar can actually be a very effective way to run an Eldar list, believe it or not. You don't really see it too much in the highest levels of competitive play, but trust me, it is still successful in many arenas. And basically, Footdar essentially is, like I said, a coin termed to talk about an army list built without vehicles or transports, essentially. So all of the Eldar units in your army will be on foot. We're going to look at the advantages and disadvantages to running an Eldar list in this way. We're also going to be looking at two ways that I found effective to run a Footdar list. We're going to be looking at what works well in each type of Footdar list. And lastly, we're going to be looking at a few tips and tricks when running a Footdar army. Now, before we go further into this, I do just want to mention that I do have a sore throat. I am feeling a little bit sick. So if my voice seems a little bit raspy, I apologize. So Footdar is a term that's, again, like I said, coined for running a Craftworld Eldar list without any transports or vehicles specifically. So in other words, just infantry squads on foot or jump infantry. Sometimes jet bike units as well, depending on how strict you want to be with your definition of Footdar. So Footdar obviously has some advantages and disadvantages to it. A lot of players will forego Footdar because there are good ways of getting your aspect warriors into close combat and into range via transports and things like that. And this seems like the obvious choice for most, right? If I have a squad of 10 Dire Avengers, how am I going to protect them? Well, I'm going to put them in a Wave Serpent. But Wave Serpents cost points, right? So there are some advantages to forgoing the Wave Serpents and just using more units. So some of the advantages are you save a lot of points on transports and vehicles. A lot of your opponent's anti-tank tech is potentially wasted now because, blast cannons, stuff like that, single shot weapons that are designed to kill things like Wave Serpents, Falcons, Fire Prisms are now going to be essentially much less effective against your army. It also allows you a greater unit coverage and more damage potential because remember, you have more units. Those units potentially, because there's more of them, can do more damage, right? And if you look at the point comparison between a Wave Serpent and a unit of any equivalent aspect warriors or other units in general, you will find that for about the same cost as a Wave Serpent, you can get a pretty decently sized aspect warrior unit that can pump out a lot more damage typically than a Wave Serpent can. So this allows you a potentially greater unit coverage and more damage potential. Now, the disadvantages to this list are that you have no transports to protect your units, which means that if you ever find your unit in a bad spot, there's really not going to be a lot of ways that you can save yourself from it. For example, if Dire Avengers have an accompanying Wave Serpent, the Wave Serpent can be moved to body block enemy units from getting into assault and things like that. If you don't have a Wave Serpent, you can't do this. So it's even more important that your Dire Avengers be safe in the first place, which requires a lot of finesse and a lot of awareness, both board awareness and the capabilities of your opponent to deal with that unit as well. Also, our craft tanks happen to be quite powerful units, and losing them again erases a powerful contestion tool with contesting objectives, going after enemy units, blocking up charge lanes, things like that, right? Which Wave Serpents absolutely excel at, and so do other vehicles. So the loss of this is actually a pretty big disadvantage. But I do think that Footdar has some very powerful potential. And what I found in some of my list building and some of my games is that there's really two ways, in my opinion, to run a Footdar list effectively. either as a hard-hitting force that relies on reserve tactics to get close to enemy units to deal damage, so either in strategic reserve using webway strike or using a webway gate to get close to the enemy to engage them on your own terms, and that also protects your units while they're in reserve because they can't be shot at or charged or anything until they arrive on the board. The next way to run them is as a gunline style army that uses heavy indirect fire, ranged firepower, and defensive abilities to inflict heavy casualties on the enemy army while mitigating any potential damage they receive, be that cover, terrain, indirect fire, things like that, to just hit the enemy and limit their ability to hit you back. So, what exactly works well in a Footdar list? So, for the hard-hitting reserve-based Footdar, it's been my experience that hard-hitting units that can devastate other enemy units straight out of reserve, using webway strike or strategic reserve, are the best units for this. Units with sustained damage over time aren't that great in this type of list. You want to do as much damage as possible when you come out because you're making up for 2 to 3 turns of their lack of presence on the board, right? Because they're not going to be there. So you need to make sure that that unit will be able to make its points costs up for the turns that it was missing. Next, psychic debuffs and buffs allow our army to deal the maximum damage possible upon arrival. These are absolutely necessary, and you want as many debuffs being thrown out there as possible. Reveal, Jinx, Guide, Doom, stuff like that, to whittle down the enemy and make it easier for you to have a successful alpha strike. And lastly, the webway gate fortification helps reduce command cost expenditure for units in strategic reserve, because remember, we only have 6 to work with now, so it's a little bit harder to do so. And it allows for more versatility in unit placement. So if your opponent really knows that you're going to come in strategic reserve on board edges, well, guess what? Now he has to worry about a webway gate as well. So having a webway gate allows for, again, cheaper command costs and much better unit placement. As for the gun style Footdar, indirect fire weapons like D cannons can be used to draw enemies in and cover objectives from getting captured. Good positioning is very much required here. Defensive buffs and abilities to increase your force's survivability are very key. Things like Fortune and Protect can help your units that your enemy can draw line of sight to survive for longer and allow you to keep shooting and dealing damage. Also, abilities that hinder enemy movement are particularly effective. Things like Restrain, that half the enemy's movement, or things like Spider's Lair, which make it harder for enemy units to move through difficult terrain, can all be helpful to give you a little bit more time to shoot and make it harder for your enemies to get on those objectives quickly. Also, counterattack units and support units are necessary as well to protect your ranged assets if the enemy gets too close. For example, Blood Angels are an army that I think does very well against Footdar, especially this gun style list, because everything in a Blood Angels army basically gets +1 to their charges, and they have a few things that allow them to, basically get charges off easier. They can do this right out of reserve, and if you don't screen properly, you could have your units very vulnerable. D cannons in combat will get absolutely ripped to shreds by Blood Angels. So, honestly, you got to be careful with that. Things that can get into assault with it quickly, you need counterattack units to be able to push them off. Things like Wraith Guards with Wraith Blades are very good at this. Wraith Lords are also very good at this, and Wraith Lords also act as a shooting unit for long range as well. And again, the webway gate also is very effective for bringing in more support, bringing in your units to support your D cannons and your backline, Warwalkers, things like that. And it can also be used as an offensive tool if you actually need to push up the field. Remember, the webway gate can be deployed in any number of ways, and you just kind of need to think about how you want to use it before you deploy it that game. For example, if you know your opponent is sitting back on his deployment zone and doesn't plan to move much, then maybe deploy the webway gate a little bit farther back, a little bit farther forward on the field so that you can actually threaten objectives and capture objectives from him that he tries to take later in the game. Or if your opponent is very aggressive, maybe deploy it further back close to your own objectives on your side so that you can rush into support if need be. So, a few tips and tricks when running Footdar. In general, you want to utilize cover to its absolute fullest because units on foot have no other real form of protection. Remember, you don't have transports to protect them. The only things you can really use to protect these units are reserve tactics and cover. So you have to use cover to its fullest. The webway gate is also a fantastic offensive tool as well as a defensive one. Remember that a webway gate also provides cover itself, so it can also be used as an additional cover piece for any of your gunline units in the back. And I didn't mention this before, but I think that a webway gate can be especially powerful in a gunline style Eldar army because of the simple fact that we now have access to a much improved hidden pathway secondary. I think it's called hidden path. Yeah, it's hidden path, the hidden path. So we have access to a fantastic secondary in which if we take a webway portal, we can easily score 15 victory points at the end of the game if we control it, which is very easy as long as you have an objective secured unit on it at all times. And lastly, keep your forces together if you can. Footdar has a much harder time supporting each other from opposite sides of the battlefield, so make sure that when you do run a Footdar list, you try to keep them together as much as possible and try not to isolate units. Isolated infantry units without immediate support, without wave serpents and fast units to get in there quick, are going to have a really hard time. So make sure you keep your army together, or at least, in the very least, they're in a position to support each other if need be. Now, I didn't have it on the slides because, to be honest with you, Footdar can be run in so many different ways, I feel. I've just found that the gunline variant and the reserve variant are the most effective. But to be honest with you, if you can make some sort of mix and match work, then Footdar can also be effective in that way. Now, a few of the key units, I think, to each type of army, obviously. In the reserve style army, you have fast units that can hit hard, like Striking Scorpions, Howling Banshees, Wraithblades, things like that, are very good in the reserve style armies because they hit hard right out of the gates and can destroy pretty much whatever they hit right off the bat. For the gunline style armies, I think that units like support weapons are extra good because, especially D-cannons, because they can sit back and ignore line of sight and also draw enemies in so that your other units can more effectively destroy them as well. And I was running an Eldar list for a while that pretty much adhered to the Eldar style foot gunline. And the thing about Eldar, I think, is that their whole army is more durable as a whole at range. So this works especially well with the gunline style Footdar army in general. And they also have a lot of ways to keep enemy units from reaching their positions effectively. So essentially, Footdar can be really powerful, but you need a lot of planning to utilize them correctly. You need to know which units are going to be in reserve, which units you're going to be using Phantasm on and things like that, to be able to successfully manage the army. And the reason why this is because if you make one mistake with this army typically, in deployment or even in the first couple of turns, if you leave a couple of units too vulnerable to enemy fire, Eldar are very squishy and they tend to die very easily, right? We're not an army like Imperial Guard, who, if they make a mistake with one unit, it's not a big deal because it's only 50 points. Our units are much more expensive than that. If you make a mistake deploying your D-cannon battery, that's 200 points down. If you make a mistake deploying a unit of Wraithblades, that's also going to be extremely expensive, 225 points down the drain. So you have to really make sure that you have the correct buff set up to ensure their success. When you're running a fast reserve-based army, you need to make sure you have the command points for Phantasm and Webway Strike, as well as the correct psychic powers to make sure that you can get into Assault and do a lot of damage when you hit the enemy. Things like Ghost Walk, Guide, Doom, things like that really go a long way. As for the gun line, you need to make sure that you position your forces correctly to begin with to ensure that they don't get shot off the board turn 1, or they're not in a good position to actually shoot to begin with. And remember, you want to put them ideally into a position where they can have range on different objectives that you know your enemy's going to go towards within the next couple turns, but also position them in a safe way so that they're not immediately shot off the board when your opponent gets to move. Which again, I've seen many players misplace Eldar units and just have them immediately wiped out. And I'm sure a lot of you have had this happen to you guys before where, you have one model peeking out of terrain, and your opponent's like, okay, I can see that guy's foot. And then the whole unit is basically destroyed, right? You have to be extra careful with that with Footdar because, again, you have no other forms of protection. So you need to be careful and cognizant of that. Now, let me share an embarrassing experience that I had in the last couple weeks when I was running a more Footdar style army. And, well, did it have any vehicles? I don't think it had a single vehicle in it, actually, but it did have jet bikes in it. So I guess it's not full Footdar really in the strictest sense, but it is close. And at one point in the game, I had one of my D-cannon batteries move slightly up and into the ruins to be able to shoot at a unit that was barely out of range. So I moved into these ruins, and I was in range of that enemy unit. That enemy unit died, and I thought that I was out of range of one of his units on the far right-hand side of the board. I didn't think he had range on me. Unfortunately for me, I measured the distance, and he was barely in range of my model. And because he was in range of at least one model in that unit, and it was by a hair's breadth, that whole D-cannon battery was shredded with plasma fire. So you just have to be, again, extra cognizant of things like that when using Footdar elements. Because again, in a more fast list, I may have had the ability to easily just battle focus away and not have an issue with that, right? Or I may be able to get out of the way with some other means. But because Footdar elements tend to be a little bit slower in general, you can expect to actually be pre-measuring and making sure that your opponents are going to be out of range next turn of your units, if you choose to move them out of position for something that you need to do. So just always double check. And again, most of the time you don't time your turns. I know in tournaments and stuff, they time their turns, but when you're learning an army, you really don't want to set yourself up for failure like that. Don't time your turns when you're trying to learn something new, especially Footdar. You want to be able to have the time to really learn the army, right? And it's kind of off topic that I mentioned that, but the only reason I do mention that is because I've noticed that sometimes newer players, when they try to start playing competitive, they'll start trying to time their own turns and things like that to try to, get in tune with what the tournaments do, right? And I would recommend against that when learning Footdar, because, if you're running a Footdar base list, first of all, you're going to be moving a lot more models. That's one thing. 2, you're going to need excellent positioning, and you could make a lot of mistakes very quickly if you decide to time your turns and if you're rushed, and then you're not going to have a good experience with the army, and then maybe you're not going to give the army a good enough chance, right? So you do want to be cognizant of that as well. So in conclusion, I think Footdar can be quite powerful if planned out strategically, but it requires a lot of foresight in both list building and gameplay, more so than your traditional typical Eldar army, which, as all of us know, is already kind of a strategic and, a feat. Let's put it that way. It's a very big strategic feat to plan an effective Eldar list. But if done right, it can be very effective. And it can actually be more effective than a lot of armies with the traditional tools like wave serpents and things like that. And Footdar is definitely not an army style for beginner Eldar players, because one must really need the correct use of the rules of all the terrain, deployment, and movement, and they need to be able to use those things at your disposal to the utmost of their ability. However, if you do have a firm grasp of the rules in regards to terrain, deployment, movement, things like that, and your list building is good and you have a plan going into the game, then Footdar can be very effective. In fact, it can be much more effective than your traditional Eldar lists under certain circumstances. I think the only place that Footdar really fails is in armies like, believe it or not, Imperial Guard. And the reason why I say that is because either they're going to screen out your assault units very effectively and give you really bad trades if you come in through reserve with a reserve style Footdar list, or the alternative is if you run a gunline style Eldar army, they're just going to out cost effectiveness you, basically, because all of their units are very cost effective and they pretty much all have ways of either staying out of your range or simply bombarding you with indirect fire. And Imperial Guard indirect fire is no joke. However, I'm not saying you can't win against it. It's just a tricky matchup and you have to plan for that, right? So you have to really utilize things like strategic reserve to bring in a lot more units than you would normally. So you have to plan for that and you have to make sure you have the correct amount of points set up to where it's not an illegal rules break if you put your units in strategic reserve when you are declaring your reserves. All right, everybody, that's it for today's video. This was probably a little bit of a shorter video today on Footdar than what I had originally planned. I wanted to give you guys a couple of different example lists of it, but I think I'm going to save that for another video because it would have made the video probably well over an hour. And to be honest with you guys, I'd rather, save it for another time. All right, everybody. Peace out. I'll see you guys next time. And if you have any comments about Footdar or you have a Footdar style army list that you want to share your success with, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you guys are running and what you guys have for this type of style of army. All right, everybody. Have a good one. See you later.